In the summer of 1997, a man checked into a hospital in Mexico City and never walked out. He arrived at night, which was how he did everything. Quietly. Without announcement. He used a name that was not his own, checked into a room that had been prepared for him, and lay down on a gurney under the cold white eye of a surgical lamp. He was 41 years old. He was the most powerful drug trafficker on earth. And he believed, with absolute conviction, that if he could just change his face, he could disappear forever. He was wrong. And the world he left behind when he died on that table is still burning. To understand Amado Carrillo Fuentes, you have to go back to Navalado, Sinaloa, in the early 1960s. This was not a complicated place. It was dust and mountains and men who worked with their hands and knew that the real money came from somewhere else. The same land that produced Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo would produce El Chapo. And it produced Amado. He was a boy who watched. While other children played, Amado stood at the edge of roads and observed older men doing things that required silence. He absorbed everything. He asked nothing. He waited. By 17 he had a job. In the language of the trade he was a Halcon. His work was simple and dangerous. He climbed to high places, watched the roads below and reported what he saw. Police movements. Army trucks. Strangers who drove too slowly and looked too carefully. He was good at it because he understood the most important lesson of surveillance. You are invisible only if you make yourself boring. He stood on rooftops in the sun and learned patience the way other boys learned arithmetic. It would become the defining skill of his life. At 20 he was managing product. At 25 he was managing routes. This was not glamorous work. It was logistics. It was counting and timing and understanding that a truck that arrives 2 hours late is a truck that might not arrive at all. Amado was not feared yet. He was not known. But the men who paid attention noticed that what he touched worked and what he promised he delivered. In a business built entirely on trust between people who could not trust each other, reliability was the rarest currency. And Amado had more of it than anyone. The man who changed everything was Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo. In the early 1980s, Felix Gallardo ran the Guadalajara cartel and sat at the center of every cocaine shipment moving between Colombia and the United States. He was the architect. He was the gatekeeper. And he needed someone to run Juárez, the most important plaza on the entire border. He chose Amado. Not because Amado was family. Not because Amado was feared. Because Amado was the kind of man who sat across a candlelit table and listened completely, said only what was necessary, and left the room having already solved the problem you hadn't finished describing yet. Felix Gallardo saw the future sitting across from him. He was right. Juárez sat directly across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas. From the air, you could see the two cities breathing against each other like lungs, separated by a thin brown river and a line drawn on a map by men who died a century before. Whoever controlled Juárez controlled the most direct corridor to Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. The highway system north of El Paso was a spine that fed the entire American interior. The plaza was not just important. It was the whole game. And Amado understood even before he arrived, that the man who held Juárez held Mexico. He arrived in Juárez in the late 1980s wearing suits that were well-fitted but never flashy. He shook hands with politicians and remembered their wives' names. He smiled at the right moments and was silent at the right moments and never, under any circumstances, did anything that made him interesting to a stranger. He did not drink publicly. He did not party. He did not carry a gun in a way that anyone could see. He was a businessman who happened to move cocaine. The distinction mattered to him enormously. He wanted to be invisible. And for a long time he nearly was. The system he inherited was inefficient. Trucks. Hidden compartments. Small loads and legitimate cargo. American border agents with flashlights and dogs and enough patience to find most of what was being moved. The Mexicans were couriers. They received a fee for transport while the Colombians collected the real wealth on the other side. The risk was enormous. The reward was modest by comparison. Every load that crossed the border by road was a calculation in which the odds moved against you every day as American detection technology improved. Amado looked at this system and saw something simple. The problem was not the border. The problem was that they were trying to go through it. He stood at the edge of a runway in the Chihuahuan desert one night and looked up. The sky was enormous and empty and completely unpatrolled. American radar could track commercial corridors, but the Mexican desert had gaps. The mountains created interference. And the military resources required to watch every square mile of sky between the Yucatan and the Rio Grande simply did not exist in adequate numbers. He did not invent drug trafficking by air. But he saw the scale that no one else had imagined. Not Cessnas. Not small prop planes with modest loads. He was thinking about something much larger. He bought Boeing 727s. The same jets that carried vacationers to Cancun and businessmen to Sao Paulo. He purchased them through shell companies in South America, through cash transactions that moved faster than questions, through layers of paperwork that pointed nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. At his peak, estimates put his fleet between 30 and 40 aircraft. He had his own pilots, his own mechanics, his own fuel supply chains. He had built an airline. It just did not appear in any directory. And it flew only one cargo. Deep in the Colombian jungle, on airstrips cut from the forest and invisible from satellite imagery because the canopy was allowed to grow back to a precise height, the loading happened at night. Workers moved in silence under red-filtered flashlights that could not be seen from altitude. The cocaine arrived in military duffel bags and was stacked in the body of the aircraft with the efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times. The pilots wore civilian clothes. The planes had registration numbers that belonged to aircraft parked legally at airports in Venezuela or Ecuador. When they lifted off the dirt runway and climbed through the dark canopy, they were ghosts before they cleared the treetops. The planes flew north, over the Caribbean, over the Gulf of Mexico, through corridors that Amado's people had mapped with obsessive precision, identifying the gaps in radar coverage, the altitude windows where commercial traffic was too dense for customs aircraft to intercept, the headings that minimized detection time over American waters. A single Boeing 727 could carry 10 tons of cocaine. 10 tons. Worth hundreds of millions of dollars on American streets. And Amado was no longer collecting a transport fee. He had negotiated ownership of the product. He was not a courier anymore. He was a partner. He was the business. In the Chihuahuan Desert, on flat dry lake beds that had been scouted from the air and cleared of rocks by hand, the planes landed in the dark. Flares lined the runway. Trucks waited at the edges. The transfer took less than 40 minutes. The cocaine moved from aircraft to vehicle and began its journey north. Sometimes the loads crossed the border in the trucks of legitimate companies whose drivers had been paid or threatened. Sometimes they moved in smaller aircraft for final delivery. Sometimes they crossed in ways that no investigation ever fully reconstructed. The planes turned south and disappeared back into the dark sky before anyone on the American side had registered that something had passed overhead. The money that came back was beyond calculation. $5 million a day. Some estimates say 10. The warehouses where cash was stored before it could be cleaned had to be managed like banks, with staff whose only job was counting and categorizing and bundling currency into systems that could be moved into the legitimate economy without triggering the scrutiny that large cash deposits invited. Amado had more money than he could spend. He had more money than he could hide. He had become, without advertising it, one of the wealthiest men in the Western Hemisphere. The Americans named him the Lord of the Skies, El Señor de los Cielos. The name spread because it was accurate. He owned the routes above Mexico. He moved so much cocaine that the price dropped in American cities because supply was exceeding demand. He was not a criminal operating in the shadows of a system. He had become the system. The sky was not the limit. The sky was his infrastructure. And standing on the stairs of his own aircraft, watching the desert turn gold in the morning light, he understood something that no trafficker before him had fully grasped. Mexico was not a transit country. It was a headquarters. But he did not want fame. He actively refused it. He watched Pablo Escobar's story from a careful distance and absorbed the lesson. Visibility is the enemy of survival. He did not want the poor to name streets after him. He did not want a television series. He did not want politicians photographed at his side. He wanted the opposite of all of it. He wanted to be the name no one knew in the rooms where everything was decided. He ate in private rooms. He traveled in small groups. He never used a credit card or signed a check. He was everywhere and nowhere. For a decade he made it work. The money had to go somewhere. He put it into concrete. Hotels in Cancun and Mexico City. Real estate across Latin America. A hospital in Mexico City that he owned under names that connected to other names that connected to accounts in jurisdictions where questions were not asked. He built front companies that moved hundreds of millions through structures that looked, on paper, like the normal activity of successful businessmen. He bought politicians not to help him but to leave him alone. He bought police commanders not to protect him but to warn him. The infrastructure of his invisibility cost as much to maintain as a small government. The Americans knew. By the mid-1990s, the DA had his name on lists and his face in files and evidence that filled rooms. They knew about the planes. They knew about the routes. They knew about the front companies. But knowing and proving were entirely different problems. And stopping him required cooperation from Mexican institutions that Amado had already purchased. Every time an investigation came close, something happened. A witness disappeared. A document was lost. A source went silent. He was never quite where anyone thought he was. The investigation file on Amado Carrillo Fuentes grew thicker every year and produced nothing that could reach him. The Colombians loved him. After Medellin collapsed and Cali took over, the new leadership evaluated their Mexican partners and concluded that Amado was categorically different from the others. He was professional. He was reliable. He did not steal product. He did not start wars with competitors that disrupted supply chains. He moved cocaine the way FedEx moved packages, on time, in full, with a level of operational discipline that the Colombians had not expected to find north of their own territory. The Cali Cartel gave him their entire business. The trust made him irreplaceable. It also made him a target. In 1996, the Cali leadership was arrested. The supply lines wobbled. The Mexican traffickers who had operated as partners to the Colombians were suddenly operating without the network that had structured everything. New suppliers had to be found. New negotiations had to be opened. New relationships had to be built with groups that were smaller, less organized, and less predictable. Amado prepared. He stockpiled. He diversified into heroin and methamphetamine. He built redundancies into every system. He was, as always, thinking 3 moves ahead. What he could not think ahead of was his own body betraying him. He was 41 and his body was failing. Years of stress and excess had damaged his heart. His blood pressure was dangerous. His weight had become a medical problem that could not be deferred. And the American indictments were being finalized. The Mexican warrants were being prepared. His name was moving from files to active pursuit. He looked at himself in the mirror and made a calculation that was both completely rational and completely insane. He would change his face. He would change his body. He would become someone else. The Lord of the Skies would cease to exist, and a new man would walk out of Mexico and live quietly in Chile, where he had investments and a life already being constructed under a different name. The plan was detailed. It had been developed over months with the care he applied to all of his logistics. False documents. Established identities. Properties in Santiago. Cover stories for the money. Surgeons who had been paid and threatened in equal measure to ensure silence. He sat at his desk and looked at the components of his new life spread before him like a business plan. He had built an empire from nothing. He had outrun every government that had tried to catch him. He had moved more cocaine than anyone in history. Surely he could manage the simpler task of becoming someone no one was looking for. On July 4, 1997, he walked into the Santa Monica Hospital in Mexico City. He used a false name, but everyone in the building knew exactly who he was. This was the hospital he owned. These were doctors he had paid. The security was his own men standing at positions they had chosen themselves. He was not afraid. He was executing a plan. He passed through the sliding glass doors and into the fluorescent light of the reception area and allowed himself to be checked in under a name that belonged to no one. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary night, completely unaware that the most powerful criminal in the Western Hemisphere was signing a form at a hospital desk. The surgery began that evening. Liposuction first, to address the weight that had accumulated over years of pressure and sedentary power. Then the facial reconstruction. The nose would be narrowed. The jaw would be reshaped. The eyes would be altered just enough that the face in the DA files would not match the face on the passport of the man boarding a flight to Santiago. The surgeons worked under brilliant lights in a theater that had been cleared of all non-essential staff. The monitors tracked his heart. The anesthetic held him still. And then something went wrong. He died at 4 a.m. on July 7, 1997. The official explanation was surgical complication. A fat embolism from the liposuction. Anesthetic failure against a heart already weakened beyond its tolerance. The surgeons attempted resuscitation. They failed. The Lord of the Skies flatlined on an operating table in a hospital he owned, surrounded by doctors he had paid, in a city he had helped corrupt. The monitors went flat. The room went quiet. And everything he had built began to die with him. The doctors who performed the surgery were found dead within weeks. One in a car trunk. One in a barrel of concrete. A third was never found at all. The theory that has never fully disappeared is that Amado was murdered on the table. That someone, his enemies or his own people or the Mexican government, decided that a dead Amado was more manageable than a vanished Amado. That the surgeons had been paid twice, once to operate and once to ensure he did not wake up. The truth died with the doctors. What remained was a body and an empire with no one at the center. His brother Vicente tried to hold it together. He failed. Vicente was not Amado. He did not have the relationships with the Colombians. He did not have the trust of the politicians. He did not have the operational discipline that had kept every moving part of the machine in alignment. The meetings became arguments. The arguments became fractures. The organization that had moved 10 tons of cocaine on a single aircraft began splitting into factions that spent more energy fighting each other than moving product. The plaza that Amado had made the most important corridor on the border became a prize that everyone wanted and no one could hold. Juárez collapsed into violence almost immediately. The murders began in 1998 and accelerated every year. The city that had been relatively stable under Amado's iron logistics became one of the most dangerous places on earth, not because the drug trade had ended but because the order that governed it had. Competing factions fought for the plaza with a brutality that reflected the absence of any authority capable of containing them. The death toll reached into the thousands per year. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Businesses closed. The city carried the scars of Amado's absence in every bullet hole and every empty storefront and every family that crossed the bridge to El Paso and never came back. But Amado's real legacy was not the collapse. It was the proof of concept. He had demonstrated that Mexican traffickers did not have to be subservient to anyone. They could own the product. They could own the transport. They could own the distribution networks. They could be the business, not the service provider. The generation that came after him, El Chapo, the Zetas, the CJNG, learned from his example the way business students learn from case studies. They built their own fleets. They developed their own supply relationships. They diversified into synthetic drugs that required no Colombian partner at all. Amado had shown them the ceiling. They decided there was nani. Planes sat on abandoned runways and rusted in the desert sun. The fleet that had once carried 10 tons of cocaine across a sky that no government could adequately patrol was grounded, seized, sold for parts, or simply left to decay in the Chihuahuan heat. Weeds grew through cracked tarmac. The fuselages bleached in the sun. The empire that had moved more cocaine than any operation in history was reduced to these monuments of oxidized metal standing in the desert like the bones of something enormous that had once been alive. The Lord of the Skies had built his empire in the air. And without him it fell back to earth. What came next was worse. What came next was the war for everything he had left behind.